Today, I have the distinct honor and privilege to introduce a true legend. Santa Clara County Supervisor Joe Simitian has represented Los Altos and Los Altos Hills for roughly 36 of his 41 years of elected service, including as a senator, assembly member, county supervisor, and member of the Palo Alto Unified School District Board of Education, as portions of Los Altos are in PAUSD. It was only during his 5 year term on the Palo Alto City Council that Joe did not represent Los Altos and Los Altos Hills. Joe, we're truly honored to have you here with us today. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody who rose and shone to be here. I'm smiling and I'm impressed and I'm pleased. So thank you for waking up and making this your morning. I appreciate it.
Great. So I have about 7 or 8 questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A after that. So let's start off with rewinding a few decades. My understanding is after college and law school, you ended up in public service, and I'd love to hear the story of how that came about.
Well, I ran for the Palo Alto School Board when I was a 22-year-old law student. That reflected the fact that I was not altogether engaged by law school at UC Berkeley when I should have been probably. There also was a board. This is the Palo Alto Unified School District Board. There was a board appointed incumbent who I thought was a little out of touch and a little older. He was 41 at the time, so I should probably own that. And had an unsuccessful run in the sense that I did not prevail, but got a very healthy 40% of the vote with the help of some folks on this call, and decided I would stay with it, hang in, and came back when I was 30. I was an unusual, atypical candidate at the time, and certainly an atypical board member because I was a bachelor, as the term was then used, and didn't have any kids in the district. People thought that was, I think, quirky and a little hard to fathom. And I just kept making the case that public education was the foundation of our system and that it was the responsibility of the entire community. So I was an atypical candidate from day one and an atypical board member, certainly, as someone who, would say, I'd ask a date to if she wanted to chaperone the high school dance at Pally or Gun. That was not the typical school board member at the time.
That's funny. So then what was the first elected office that you ended up holding?
I served on the Palo Alto School Board for 8 years, from 1983 to 1991. And some of you have heard me say this with respect to those who served at other levels. I actually think serving on a local school board is one of the toughest jobs there is in public office. You have responsibility for the thing that people hold most dear, which is their kids. And You have inadequate resources often. You're constrained by state law in many respects. So you don't have the resources or the flexibility you'd like to do one of the toughest jobs for the thing people are most passionate about, which is their kids. So that was a great, frankly, learning. People said, well, isn't it tough going up against PG&E in Sacramento? And I said, not when you've seen 200 angry parents in a room. PG&E looks easy by comparison.
Especially those Palo Alto parents. They're nothing like the Los Altos parents, right?
I'm going to let that one just slide right by.
I'll take the arrows for any bad questions. So you were responsible for many pieces of legislation and many actions during your time in public office. Would love to know maybe the two or three biggest highlights of your 41
Part of the challenge and the joy of being a state legislator, particularly in the state senate where there are just 40 members, is the ability to weigh in on a range of issues. If my wife Mary were here, she'd say, he likes to poke his nose into everybody's business. But and some of the former staff members will remember, when I said, let's focus. We focused on energy, water, environment, education, privacy, transportation safety, elder abuse. And people would start laughing like, that's your idea of focus? But really, all of those areas were areas where my office and I had a chance to weigh in. To answer your question more directly, I think probably everybody on the call knows it's against the law in California to hold that handheld cell phone up to your ear. Excuse me. That's the legislation that I authored back in the day that took me 6 efforts to get passed. Governor Schwarzenegger actually is the one who finally signed the bill into law. Transitional kindergarten for those of you who have kids or grandkids here in California. That was the first new grade established in California in more than 100 years, and that was a piece of legislation I was proud to author. Renewable energy, which is so essential to addressing climate change, among other things. My office and I were pushing for 20% by 2010, made that happen, and then 33% by 2020, made that happen. And then, as I say, all those other areas. And then, candidly, Joe, one of the most poignant moments for me is standing on the floor of the California State Assembly earlier in my tenure at 3:30 in the morning on the last night of session, trying to get some justice for a fellow who'd been wrongly convicted, a constituent of mine named Rick Walker, who had been doing, I think it was 20 to life, something like that, for a murder he did not commit. And that was finally acknowledged after 12 years, but he was struggling with the system. And so I had to carry a piece of special legislation and get 2/3 vote on the last night of session. And it was a reminder of what public service is or is supposed to be about. So a lot of opportunity to do great work on a number of fronts. And the acknowledgement I should make at each and every turn is none of that happens with just one person engaged. You got some alumni on the call who identified themselves. They were the indispensable ingredient. And the other thing I would say is, in an 80-member assembly or 40-member state senate, one member does not make a majority. You got to bring other folks along, and a lot of people helped bring those efforts to fruition.
Great, great answer. So many of us have gotten to know you over the years. You've really developed a deep relationship with the residents of Los Altos. What stands out for you in terms of your relationship with Los Altos, other than the farmers markets, which I know is one of your favorites?
Well, I have, over the course of my time in public office, I have represented 21 different cities and towns in San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Santa Cruz counties. And Los Altos, of course, is my next door neighbor in Palo Alto. People in Los Altos, and I want to say thank you for this, really have extended themselves through the years to make me feel welcome, to make me feel like Los Altos is my second hometown. I will tell you, I think the Los Altos Rotary Club had a lot to do with that. I was a frequent visitor to Los Altos Rotary early on. And, every community is different. In some communities, the local Rotary Club is a group of good folks, but they are perhaps not particularly representative of where the community is. My experience in Los Altos was that, if I was willing to take the questions, sometimes probing from Los Altos Rotary members, I had a pretty good sense, frankly, of where a lot of folks in the community were. So I would give a shout out to Rotary in Los Altos as having been a significant part of developing that relationship. And I do the sidewalk office hours because I think people are and have for a very long time been disaffected from their government at every levels. And the most frequent comment I get at sidewalk office hours is, I don't have anything for you today. I'm just glad you're here. So if I did, I could tell you. And, people, I think, really appreciate the opportunity to talk directly to their elected officials, give them an earful if they want, or ask, hey, why'd you vote this way? Why'd you vote that way? All of that has helped develop a relationship that is a real one and a personal one.
That's great. I know I've always appreciated being able to reach out to people who are serving, and your accessibility is unparalleled. So thank you for that. What is the impact of county government that residents least understand?
Let me answer the question this way. Whatever piece of county government they don't use is the piece they don't understand or often even know exists. One of the things about county government that's challenging, frankly, as an elected official is that county government is responsible for so many different and disparate functions. I mean, where else are you going to be responsible for more than 20,000 employees, a $12 billion a year budget, but have everything from an animal shelter down around San Martin in the South County to a couple of municipal airports to social services and welfare functions for a vast number of folks in the county. And then, oh, by the way, there are 3 hospitals and 13 different healthcare clinics. A new one now in the North County, the first of its kind in the county's 150-year history, about which I'm very gratified. So I think people know the parts of the system that they use. They may not even think of it as being the county, whether it's Rancho San Antonio next to Mid-Penn, or the Los Altos Library, which people understandably and appropriately think of as their library, but which is in fact part of a county library system. So it's what you use that you think, oh, that's the county. If you have a local police force, then you have an attachment to the city. If you have the sheriff, you think, oh no, that's how we get our public safety protection. So it varies immensely from person to person, from district to district. The last thing I'll say is there are 15 cities and towns in the county. 9 of them are in my 1/5 of the district. So that is a unique circumstance. It just means that it's incumbent on the 5th district supervisor, that's me, to have real relationships and understandings of the 9 different cities and towns and know that they've got different needs. I'm just looking at Robin here. Hey, Robin, what Robin needs in Los Altos is going to be different than what somebody needs in Cupertino. It's different.
Got it. What advice would you give to younger public servants or those considering public service?
Well, I think I would say think long and hard about whether public service is for you, and given the demands of public service and the sacrifices, and also think about whether or not you want to do your public service through elective office. I think I inferred, Joe, when you said public service, you were thinking about elected office, but now I'll show myself to be a product of the '60s. The saying then was, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And, I believed it then, and I still believe it all these years later. That said, there are a lot of ways to be part of the solution. You don't have to be a political activist. You don't have to be an elected official. You can be a great teacher and raise, or help educate future generations of good citizens. You can be a great parent and raise great kids who, go on to be good citizens and contributors. You can be a civil service professional and contribute in that way. You can be a business person and create jobs and generate tax revenue, and that's being part of the solution as well. So it's different for everyone. I will say, and I don't think this is a surprise to any of you, we're in a more trying time in terms of being an elected official. I startled a group of employees the other day by talking about a death threat that I had, in the last couple of years. It's not the first, and that's not. And I'm sure some of the elected officials on this call could tell you their own stories. It's part of the work, and it's not for everybody. So you just have to ask yourself, am I prepared to make the sacrifices and meet the demands of the work? And if you are, I will say, to close on a more positive note, it's incredibly exhilarating and really immensely satisfying. But you got to ask yourself, do I understand what it really is about, and am I prepared to go that path?
Great. We're flying through the questions, which will give us more time for Q&A, which is great. My last question for you, Joe. As your supervisor term comes to an end, what's next for Joe Simitian?
Well, that's an easy answer. I have no idea. And my wife Mary and I are responding in kind, which is our plan is we have no plans. So right now, my primary obligation is to wrap up my work at the county, make sure the office is ready for the next supervisor, Margaret Abe Koga, who I wish well, and also to try and push projects across the line. I mentioned in passing we have a new health clinic that serves the North County, Palo Alto, Mountain View, Los Altos, and Los Altos Hills. Literally, the first time we've had a clinic in our district in the history of the county for a very essential function, obviously healthcare for people of modest means. There are a half dozen other projects, Joe, that I'm trying to push across the finish line or get far enough along that they have to be finished, that I don't have to worry, well, that won't happen once I walk out the door. So the child and adolescent psychiatric facility in San Jose at the Valley Medical Center, a $400 million plus proposition that's been a 10-year labor of love, a couple of housing projects here on county land in Palo Alto, a teacher housing project, and project for folks with developmental disabilities, trying to get these things either, as I say, across the finish line or far enough along that I know they will come to fruition and serve folks in the community. And but as to what comes next, the folks who know me, and I expect I'll see a few smiles from folks who know me well. I have a bookshelf that puts Kim Cranston's to shame. No disrespect, Kim. And I am looking forward to actually having time now to read some of those books. One of the trade-offs is in public service is, and I think, all of you in your lives probably face the same thing. There's the active side and there's the contemplative side. And the pressure is always, as an elected official, do this, do that, get it done, move it along. And so which is very satisfying, but a little more time for the contemplative side is something I'm looking forward to. I intend to think great thoughts, Joe. That's what I intend to do with my time.
I can see that on SNL, Thinking Great Thoughts with Joe Simitian. All right. Well, thank you so much for a great conversation. I'm going to switch this over to gallery view here, and we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. I know everyone is going to want to take a few seconds to thank you, which many did during the introductions. So instead of doing it drip by drip for the next 30 to 45 minutes, what I'd like to do is give us all an opportunity to thank Joe. If you could please unmute yourselves, and we're going to give a rousing Los Altos and Palo Alto and elsewhere round of applause and some cheers for over 4 decades of service to our communities. Please join me in thanking Joe Simitian right now.
Oh,
Thank you,
Thank
Joe.
you, Joe.
Oh,
Thank
good,
you.
Joe.
Yay.
Yay. Thank you.
well, this is
Thank
worth
you,
getting
Joe.
up for, guys. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right. So we're gonna go back to mute. All got it out of your systems, and now if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand, and I'll call on you. Remember, we ask one per person and no speeches, so that we can get through everybody, and then we'll try and wrap up around 9:30. So. I am not seeing any hands raised. Oh, here we go. Janine, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you. My question has to do with kind of what's going on in the news as a result of elections, et cetera. And it's this. I'd like to hear your thoughts on, how we get around or how we address how whatever word you want to use, legislation and even social norms that are resisting, um, rejecting or that are resisting. How do we resist the initiatives to reject programs and even providing services along racial demographics? I mean, my work is a lot of that. And so I'm starting to feel the pressure where they're like, oh, why are you only serving those people?
Well, I think there are a lot of different levels I could respond from, but I think I'd like to take kind of a bigger picture, larger opportunity to say we're a diverse county here in Santa Clara County. I think some of you will know more than 40% of the population is in fact foreign born. We are a minority majority county. And, I think we spend a lot of time congratulating ourselves, but I frankly think we have a lot of work to do to figure out how we're going to make all that work. And the challenge ahead of us, and this is certainly not unique to my thinking, is how do we create a multiracial, multi-ethnic society community that works for everybody? And, I underscore everybody. The county has changed. If you flip through my high school yearbook and look at those graduating seniors, the pictures look very different than the folks I see at work and in the community and, out on the street. And as I say, I think we congratulate ourselves a lot, but I think there's a lot of work to do. The concept that most appeals to me, to answer your question, is one that's sometimes just shorthanded or described as unity in diversity. And what that means is there's an overarching umbrella that is the sense of community that we all have, that, hopefully everybody in one of these squares looks and says, that's the person who's part of my community. Now, it doesn't mean we aren't very different people in a lot of different ways. And we can be who we are. We can be, proud of who we represent, where we came from, what our history and story is. But I think we have to find a way to both let that happen and, in fact, encourage it, while at the same time we create an overarching sense of community. We've had a kind of a long, not very productive conversation in the country that sort of suggests it's either assimilation or multiculturalism. I don't think that's been a particularly productive conversation. I think you can be who you are, still be part of a larger community. And I think that's what a successful community, state, and nation will be in the years ahead if we get it right. If we don't, then I think it's problematic. So the shorter answer would have been unity in diversity. It's a concept that's been around for not just generations, but centuries, millennia. And it's sort of one that has guided my thinking in a lot of different ways.
All right, let's go to Sally Meadows. And then, Jerry, I see your hand up. I'll go to you next.
Thank you again, Joe. So my question is, I've been following the County Board of Education saga, and I'm not sure I understand it very well. It seems to have further evolution that I'm surprised the direction it's taken with the former superintendent. I wonder if you could give us a Cliff Notes version, explain what's going on there, and what you think the next steps are, and will the new board be able to help? And I just find the whole thing puzzling, because I've always been very impressed with Dr. Dewan.
Well, thank you. Here's what I would say. We have a complex system of government in California, including a lot of special districts, and it's not only complex, it's largely off the radar for most members of the public, including people like you who are pretty engaged. I mean, if a local council member or mayor doesn't feel, like you can wrap your arms around the issue, imagine what that's like for other members of the public. What I will say, just to cut to the chase, is the county of Santa Clara is a different governmental entity than the County Office of Education. And, because the word county is in both of them, and because Santa Clara County is in both of them, people often conflate the two, but they are really different levels of government and have different governing principles. We are an unusual county in Santa Clara County because we're one of just 5 out of 58 counties that does not elect the county superintendent. So, it's something most folks would never have given any thought to. But in 53 of the other counties, they elect the county superintendent of schools, not in Santa Clara County. On the other hand, the 7 members of the County Board of Education are elected. And the short version is there's been more than a little tension between a majority of that elected board and their appointed superintendent. And they've gone through a lot of superintendents over the last dozen years or so. Literally 3 or 4 one after another after another. It's a place that is struggling, I think, for continuity of leadership. There are two big questions out there for folks who are concerned about this organization and the work it does, that being the County Office of Education. There has been some discussion about whether or not Santa Clara County should join the ranks of those who elect their superintendent. And there are, pros and cons. And, there are some who say, well, that would stabilize the office and it would provide the superintendent with some independent authority that would be important vis-a-vis the 7-member elected board. There are others who say, no, you don't want to, quote, politicize the County Office of Education. You want a professional educator, not somebody who's a candidate for public office, to which other people would respond, well, somehow they make that work in 53 other counties. So question number one is, should that superintendent be elected or appointed? A little bit of a, civics class that probably most folks aren't all that interested in, but it does have real impacts on the delivery of service. Then the second piece, which is much less familiar to me and something I've only recently become aware of, apparently here in Santa Clara County, if the Board of Supervisors took action and can do that apparently unilaterally, according to our lawyers, if the Board of Supervisors took action, it could make the 7 members of the Santa Clara County Office of Education Governing Board of Trustees, it could make them appointees rather than elected officials. So right now, when in fact, we just voted and there was a hotly contested campaign and Jessica Spicer prevailed over the incumbent, Grace Ma. But those seats are actually seats that could be appointed rather than elected if the Board of Supervisors took action to make it so. And that has only recently, it's the first time I've ever, in 41 years, first time I've ever heard anybody raise that possibility just within the last year. So back to you, Sally, the answer is there's a lot of tumult there, different factions at the County Office of Education, tension between an appointed superintendent and an elected board. And that's got people talking about whether or not they want to elect the superintendent and appoint the board. Fortunately, that'll be left to a new Board of Supervisors on the appointment of the board members, and it will be left to the voters as to whether or not they want to elect or appoint the county superintendent. Sorry for the civics lesson, everybody, but that's the tangled web it is.
No, super interesting, especially given some of the things we've seen locally as well. So let's go over to Jerry Rosenblum.
Thank you. Let me just say briefly, my wife reminded me that we've actually had our first house in Los Altos in 1960, and that she was very active in League of Women Voters and American Association of University Women and refugee settlement in the county. So I don't want to slight that. Joe, I recall that after the 2016 election, you had several town meetings where you described your journey across the country to interview voters and to see what motivated their vote. And I wondered if you had any further observation about the 2024 election.
Sure. And my punchline observation is that the nation, the political system, and the Democratic Party, of which I am a member, has been slow to recognize what happened in 2016 and to adapt. I went off, for those of you who wonder what we're talking about, I went off after the 2016 election to 3 different counties around the country that had not only voted for President Trump in that election, but that had flipped, that had previously been Democratic in their orientation, had voted for Barack Obama, but that for one reason or another flipped and voted for President Donald Trump in 2016. I looked around the country at the time and saw that 46% of the American electorate had voted for Donald Trump. In California, that number was 32%. In Santa Clara County, it was 21%. And in Palo Alto, where I live, it was 12%. So you didn't have to be very thoughtful to conclude well, I guess the rest of the country sees this situation quite differently than the places I represent. Or as I said, I was living in a bubble, in a bubble, in a bubble. And so I went off to North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Michigan and visited 3 different counties a week each in those counties, and came away with a very much enhanced sense of the disaffection that a lot of voters felt towards the political system generally, and the Democratic Party in particular. And so, the postmortems that have been written the last couple of weeks leave me frustrated, because these are all things that were very clear in the aftermath of the 2016 election. And while I was relatively early on the ground in those places, certainly by the end of 2017, books were written, op-eds were everywhere. The online world lit up with talk about the disaffection of working class Americans. And yet it seemed like 8 years later, we were startled or surprised somehow. So I feel like we, the nation told us 8 years ago, you people don't get it. And 8 years later, they were still saying, you people still don't get it. And so I think it's time that we get it and figure out how we create a political system and an economic system that works for the almost 2/3 of Americans who don't have a bachelor's degree. In our area, we're used to folks with multiple graduate degrees, and I think that's great. I'm one of those folks who believes that education is the path. But and a shout out to those of you who do that work. But almost 2/3 of the country's population doesn't have a BA. They used to be able to make a decent middle class living. That is less and less the case. And I don't think we should be surprised that their view is things haven't gotten better. It's been a long time. And if the system needs a good swift kick in the pants, we're going to do that without regard to what the collateral damage or consequences might be. And that's kind of where we are.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Let's go to Gary Hedden. And I want to congratulate Gary on planting his 500th tree in Los Altos. We were number 415, interesting area code. So, Gary, thanks for all you do.
Oh, thank you, Joe. Both Joes, but yeah, tree number 500 is a big valley oak in Lincoln Park, and come next April we'll do a little celebration on Arbor Day. But my question to Joe is on the environmental theme again. One of the big efforts, of course, is switching from gas to electric, and we're doing a lot. But one of the barriers is the cost. If you want to do a heat pump technology in your home, it's a lot of money. I just put in a mini split and it was thousands of dollars. So is there any effort by the county or anybody really to try to come up with a way of maybe creating a pot of money that people can borrow from and pay back on change of ownership when the house changes? Something along that line. What can we do, Joe?
Well, I would encourage folks who share this concern to communicate with folks in Washington, D.C., the sense of urgency that I know you attach to it, Gary, but that candidly not everybody does. I think one of the challenges that the Biden administration struggled with was that there was some very good work done by the administration and even by Congress, who gets a bad rap for a lot of things. But a lot of that was slow to roll out. And if you have a sense of urgency on these items, and I think we should, then you got to really push the benefits out. You've got to educate the community that the benefits are there. You got to sustain them over time so that people continue to take them up. So I would say one of the things, you've got a new member of Congress who will take office, and it's Sam Liccardo in a matter of weeks. We've got a delegation that I think is sympathetic up and down the peninsula and the South Bay on these issues. We'll see where the new administration lands on the set of issues you just described. But I think anything you can do to say to them, hey, we got to go with things that are already in place but are simply slow and rolling out, that's my advice on this one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And I'm going to ask before we go to Pete, if there are any other questions, please raise your hand now so I know how to manage the remaining time we have and we can get Joe out of here at 9:30. Let's go over to Pete Daly.
All right, I'm going to try unsuccessfully to make it a quick question. I want to return to the topic of education, Joe, if we can, particularly higher education. And having been a student at one of our fine public institutions and also having gone to grad school at a couple other places, including Stanford, one of the things I experienced at Stanford the day before my first seminar, because I'd like to, make sure I know where I'm going and all that. And I felt like an imposter. I saw somebody cleaning the bricks on the history corner, the old quad, with a toothbrush and a bottle of compressed air. And I thought to myself, geez, we don't even have the budget to keep the human feces at a Kroger fountain at Berkeley. So how can Stanford do this, right? And at the same time, while I was there, I saw Stanford increase the use of its endowment to subsidize resource challenged students. And if you are accepted to Stanford, and now if your family makes less than $150,000 a year, your tuition, your room and board, your books, and everything are paid for by the Stanford endowment. It's easier and more accessible to get a degree from Stanford if you're qualified than it is to get a degree from Berkeley if you're resource challenged. So it's a funding issue. And meanwhile, we have areas of the state with no higher education and no indication that either the state college system or the UC system has any intention of opening a campus, for example, in a place like Shasta County, where you have a rural, uneducated population. And we, in our educated corner of the world, have a tendency to disdain them. But really, what they lack is opportunity and funding.
Pete, I'm sure there's a question in here somewhere.
So what are we going to do? I mean, let's fund the universities. How do we when I started at Cal, it was less than $500 a semester to go there for tuition. And now it's off the charts for tuition. And it's a state funding issue.
My reaction is, yes, it is a state funding issue. And I think this is one where the time and attention and advocacy efforts of the group together here can and should be directed to the state level and our state legislators. I was now I'm looking back literally a little more than 20 years. When I was an assembly member, I chaired the very obscure but very significant budget subcommittee on education finance. And I was a big advocate for the then not yet built UC Merced. And finally, somebody came to me and said, "What's with you and UC Merced, man? You're from Silicon Valley. What do you care?" And I said, "Well, I care because, to your point, Pete, I said I care because the Central Valley, can't realize its potential if we don't have some educational capital invested in that region." And I think it made sense for the region. I also thought it would relieve pressure on other UC campuses, to your point about opportunity, up and down the state. And here's one that's a little bit different, doesn't get talked about a lot. Gary, shout out to you. I think there's an environmental benefit because for those of us who are feeling the pressure along the coast of California for growth and development and saying, what can we do about that? Well, the answer is you can make other parts of California attractive for jobs and for residents. And that wasn't going to happen if we didn't have these kinds of educational assets in the Central Valley and other parts of rural California. So I would say keep pushing on the state legislators. And I think it's helpful to make these arguments about why these campuses matter, not just to the locations that are the beneficiaries, but to the entire state. And, last thing I'll say is I think the system can and does respond. I saw Peter from our community college board on the call. Community colleges are one of the great untapped, I shouldn't say untapped. Community colleges are one of the sort of underappreciated assets of our system. They do excuse me, 3 different jobs. They prepare people for 4-year education at a fraction of the cost, and they provide industry valued certification and education that allows people to go directly into the workforce. And they provide venues for lifelong learning. And they do it, as I say, at a fraction of the cost that other systems do. And so I think we have finally begun to realize the value and importance of our community college system in California. And, you know, the other thing I would say is I think the high cost and the sort of exclusivity of the systems that you refer to, Pete, has sort of become normalized. You know, nobody gasps anymore when somebody says their student debt is $250,000. You know, when I graduated from Colorado College, a small private liberal arts college that had a pretty hefty tuition by the standards of the day, and then law school at Berkeley. So, you know, I'm looking at your Cal shirt there, which was considered a top 10 law school, still is. It was free, as you point out. But that combination of things meant my student debt when I graduated after 7 years of first-rate higher education was about $3,500. Now, even adjusting for inflation, that's negligible compared to the burden that we just act as if it's normal or okay for young adults to carry through the rest of their lives. So the shorter answer would have been talk to your folks at the state. They're the ones who need to renew the commitment to higher education here in California, and realize what an extraordinary value we have with our community colleges, which I think have stepped into the breach admirably in many respects, certainly in our area. Joe?
Sounds like you need to take my advice and be a UC Regent and actually bring your wealth of knowledge and experience to this challenge, Joe.
TBD, Pete. We'll see what happens in life.
I'm sure Pete will be lobbying you endlessly. So good luck with that, Joe. Let's go over to Daphne. I think. And we have Janine as well. So let's try and get in 2 questions, and then no more hands up, please. We're gonna wrap it up. So go ahead, Daphne.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you so much for your work on housing, in particular, the teacher housing project that came to Palo Alto. I was just wondering if you have any lessons learned for the people on the ground who are trying to advocate for more housing, and really trying to push it forward.
Daphne, thanks. You know, first piece of advice, which is advice I gave at a community meeting in Los Altos some years ago when somebody asked a similar question, is hug a NIMBY. And what I mean by that is this issue's gotten way too polarized. If I ask most people in the peninsula, look, do you want the peninsula to be a welcoming place? And do you want families that are starting out to have the same opportunities you did? Almost every hand in the room is going to go up. If I ask then, do you want to do that in a way that destroys the character of your neighborhood and your community? No one's going to raise their hand. So, you know, there's a way to thread that needle, but the way you thread that needle is not by sort of disregarding or disrespecting the legitimate concerns that people raise in the process. Now, not all of them are legitimate, fair enough. But when folks, you know, I always said as a council member way back when, it was easy. I voted for the good projects and I voted against the bad projects. And people kind of rolled their eyes like, well, that's glib. Well, it may be glib, but it was true. It's like, you know, the way to build support for housing is to show rigor when people bring bad projects forward, and to show support when people bring good projects forward. But as I say, the starting point in all of that has to be some acknowledgement and respect for and addressing legitimate concerns where they're addressed. Because when you address the legitimate concerns, you know, it makes it harder for people to argue against housing in the community. The other thing I would say is, you know, we have a lot of programs, funding's an issue, the process is burdensome, you know, all of that. Yeah. But the way to build housing is to build housing. And I'm sorry if that also sounds flip, but, you know, people ask me, well, why did you take on these individual projects in addition to the work the county has done with our Measure A from 2016 that you all voted for, that created close to $1 billion in support for affordable housing. But I took on the teacher housing project. I took on the leadership for the project that provides units for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because I thought, all right, we need to stop focusing exclusively on programs and say, let's get 110 units of educator housing built. Let's get 50 units of housing for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Does it solve the problem, quote unquote? No, but it's a start. And not to put pressure on any of your council members who are participating, but the next election cycle, I would encourage you to say to every candidate who runs, in addition to being generally supportive, will you champion one new housing project? Ask yourself if 100 elected officials in the northwest portion of Santa Clara County had each said, I will make sure that I personally lead on getting 100 units of housing developed. Do the math. It's a pretty significant effort. So the first thing I would say is try and build bridges, find common ground with folks who may not seem like natural allies. And the second thing I would say is ask every new council member, every candidate for office, if they will take on at least one project, because if everybody does one piece of the puzzle, then all of a sudden the pieces fit and we're done.
Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. We've got 2 minutes left, so go ahead, Janine, on our last question.
Okay, thank you. I'll talk fast. In talking about how the state spends its bank account, I mean, in this call, I've heard, there are two monumental expenditures: housing, education. I've heard great pleas for both important. We can't afford to do both well, or can we? How do you, in your mind, weigh the two choices in terms of subsidies, underwriting, housing, or education, and then their intersectional impact on climate change? Because obviously doing both in well will help that. But I just want to really get down to the two competing, askers for funding.
Yeah, I think the in 30 seconds, what I would say is, in the education arena, the funding has to be there to get the job done, but we also have to expect some accountability. And there's always been a tension around that. On the housing front, I think we sometimes confuse the quote homelessness problem with the housing challenge. They're obviously interconnected, but I would say the housing challenges can be addressed most successfully and least expensively if we think more about balancing jobs and housing. And we haven't done a very good job of that in our area. In the late 90s, and now I am dating myself, Joe, in the 90s, I remember observing that we had built, we had created 6 jobs for every unit of housing. And then we were surprised that there was a housing crisis, or that housing was out of reach for a lot of families. You got to bring the systems into balance. If you do that on the housing front, a lot of these other quote problems will take care of themselves, and we won't need to fund as much as we currently do in the housing arena. We'll always need government investment on affordable housing because the market, frankly, just isn't going to go there absent some financial support. The market will go towards more profitable market rate housing. Those are some quick thoughts in the time we have left.
Great. Thank you, Joe. So we will wrap it there. Just a few quick announcements. LACC will be off for the holidays. Our next meeting will be Friday, January 10th at 8:30 a.m. We will have a discussion with our recently former mayor, Jonathan Weinberg, a retrospective. So that'll be on January 10th. If you'd like to be added to the LACC mailing list, please send an email to info@losaltoscommunitycoalition.org. The email is posted in the chat. And a big thank you, as always, to the Los Altos Mountain View Community Foundation for providing LACC with financial and in-kind support. Joe, it's been a true honor to host you here today. Thank you once again for your decades of service to the citizens of Los Altos and beyond. And I'll open up all the mics if you guys want to unmute again, and let's give Joe a final rousing round of applause as we wrap up today. Thank you,
Thank,
Joe.
Thanks, Joe.
thank you. And let me just shout out over it all. Thank you to everyone on the call, both for your active engagement as constituents, for your support in my efforts. I didn't get to do this without your support and help, many of you in a lot of ways. And for the Alumni Association, the former staff members who were part of the call as well, let me just say, I know that none of the work would have gotten done without you. And I want to make sure that everybody on the call knows that as well. I see Kim nodding because he's had this observation. We push the electeds to the front. That's the nature of our political process. But back at the office, there are people who are actually rolling up their sleeves and getting the work done. And the folks who introduce themselves as former members of our office deserve more praise than they ever get and more thanks than they ever get. So thank you to them. Thank you to you. Enjoy your day. And it's been the privilege of a lifetime. Thanks, everybody.
Many thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. And on behalf of the LACC Steering Committee, we'd like to wish you all a Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah, a fantastic Festivus, whatever holiday you are celebrating, and we will see you all in 2025.